Well, you know, the city of Milwaukee has just become famous for something other than being the beer brewing capital of the United States. Did you hear the story this week about Adele, Bunsen baker? Well, Milwaukee can now boast that it's the home of the oldest individual ever to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, which, as we know, is in Tanzania. And that's right, she was actually 91 years old when she did this. And 80, as she's known by her friends, said that she'd been training to do this 19,340-foot climb ever since she was the young age of 83 years old. What made this even more interesting is this 5'2" great-great-grandmother said that on the day she left, she decided not to wear the conventional mountain climbing boots that all climbers use. But instead, she opted to wear her Sunday best shoes. She said that she felt much more comfortable in her red Sunday shoes than she did in her bulky boots. And she thought that because they were her Sunday shoes, that maybe God would keep an extra close eye on her for wearing those. Adie started off with her friend Emma, who was 84 years old, who had been her next-door neighbor for 47 years. But Emma had to stop and go back after only walking 320 feet. She said her knees started shaking uncontrollably. Well, you know, we are really excited this week to be starting a new message series that we're calling Game of Stones. And over the next 12 weeks, we're going to be taking a closer look at some of the specific words that God gave to the nation of Israel. And these words were so important that he actually chiseled them into stone. Not once, but as we're going to find out, he actually did it twice and then gave them to Moses. These words, in many ways, have become the moral compass for people of the Christian and the Jewish faith down through the centuries. And one of the other fascinating things is that, in a way, we are picking up this story from last week's conclusion of our Heroes series, because the central character in this story is, in fact, Moses. Now, most of us know about the Ten Commandments, and we know that Moses was given them on Mount Sinai. But I would guess that there's a lot of us that know this story, but we don't know all of this story. And for that, we can likely blame Charlton Heston and the 1956 movie, The Ten Commandments. Now, this morning, we're going to try and paint a picture for you of the events that surrounded the passing down of the Ten Commandments, because it's important that we understand that they were not given to the nation of Israel in a vacuum. The nation of Israel was given these important 10 rules to live by at a time when they really needed to hear that. And it's this context that we really want to focus on this morning. But just before we do that, what if you've ever taken a trip to the same place over and over and over and over again, and you just keep going there because there's something about that place? There's something about going back to that place that you just love. Maybe it's a cottage, maybe it's a restaurant, maybe it's a city or town, but there's just something about that place that you love. Maybe it's got memories attached to it. What we often don't grasp about the story of Moses is that he had a place. In fact, he had a place where he would often go, and when he went there, he would always have a significant encounter with God. In fact, God would actually draw him there, and often represented these huge crossroads and defining moments in his life when he would receive these important messages and instructions from God. Well, the place was Mount Sinai, and this is actually a picture of it. What most people don't realize is that throughout the book of Exodus, Moses actually went up to Sinai. He climbed this mountain on at least 8 different occasions. And these mountain climbing excursions always had a significant impact on him as well as the nation of Israel. Well, this morning, I'm going to act as your so-called travel agent as we travel up and down the mountain with Moses. And we're going to work our way through the story of how the Ten Commandments came to be. And I hope you're not squeamish of heights, because we're going to be heading up and down with him all 8 times. I think what we're going to discover on those trips is that God had a plan for the nation of Israel. And the words that he gave to his chosen people on those stone tablets were more than simply providing them with a moral framework, but they really were paving the way for a whole new way of living and a whole new work that he wanted to do in and through them. So let me set this up for you. Exodus 19 starts off by telling us this, that on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. So it says in Exodus 19 that the nation of Israel arrived at the foot of Sinai on the third new moon, which gets them there about 7 weeks after the Exodus from Egypt. So it had been less than 2 months since the people had seen God miraculously use the plagues to deliver them from Egypt. It had been less than 2 months since the people had seen God miraculously part the Red Sea. It had been less than 2 months since the people had seen God miraculously wipe out the entire Egyptian army. And it had been less than 2 months since the people had seen God miraculously keep them alive by giving them fresh water and quails and manna. In the past 7 weeks, all 2 million plus of the Israelites traveled almost halfway to the land that God had promised to give them. And what all that means is that it was just 8 weeks prior to this that they had all been slaves in Egypt. In fact, all these people knew in their lives was slavery. And this becomes an extremely important piece of information for us to remember. They had never known anything different than their lives in Egypt. They had never known anything different than slavery. For 430 years, their people had been slaves. They had all, every single one of them, been born and raised in slavery. And now, even though they were free from their oppressors, remember that they were homeless. And they were on a road, and they were looking for a new home. They likely didn't even know how to live as people with freedom. And at this point, they likely didn't have a clue as to where they were even going. And get this, because of the size, because there were 2 million of them, they were moving at a rate of about 4 miles a day. And all they really knew as they traveled together was that God had performed all of these miracles, and he had obviously empowered Moses to be their leader, and they likely relied very heavily on him for everything. What I want you to see here is that God was using the timing of all these previous events to lead them to this very place, because it was here that he was going to meet them and provide them with what it was that they really needed at this moment. So as we move into the last half of the book of Exodus, we're introduced to Moses, the mountain climber. And I will admit that the chronology of the events of the next many chapters in Exodus can be somewhat difficult to navigate. The events surrounding Israel's experience at the foot of Sinai can be challenging to understand. And I'd suggest, again, that part of it comes from the fact that we have this idea from the Ten Commandments movie that Charlton Heston painted. What's important that we grasp, though, before we get into it, is that Moses was functioning as kind of a broker between the Israelites and God. He was functioning as a mediator between God and the people. And it was on the mountain that God chose to reveal to him these specific terms of this new covenant that he was giving to the people. So let's look chronologically through Moses' trips up and down the Mount Sinai. I think one of the things that we often forget is that this incident with the 2 million Israelites sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai was not actually the first time that he had met God there. Moses' first encounter with God at Sinai happened likely about 1 year and 2 months before the incident. You remember, he was working as a shepherd for his father-in-law Jethro in Midian. Remember us talking about that last week? You might remember that the story in Exodus chapter 3 goes like this. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now realize this, the mountain of God is another name for Mount Sinai. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. why this bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So Moses stood there in shock because he knew all too well of the experience that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had had with this God. And he knew that this God was not in the habit of meeting people this way. So understanding that this was a big, life-altering encounter, his response that you might expect from him was what? He was afraid. He was terrified. God told Moses in those moments that he had been chosen to be the facilitator of the nation of Israel's freedom, and went on to tell him, I know the sufferings. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them, talking about the nation of Israel in Egypt. God told Moses that he would be the one to act as God's voice to Pharaoh. And he also assured Moses that he would be with him. And he said, and this becomes an important piece of information for us. God said this to him, this shall be a sign that I have indeed sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So God is in fact telling Moses that he'll be back here someday, that it will become a significant location for him and his chosen people. God said to Moses that this mountain was going to be unlike any other place because it was going to become an important symbol for their relationship to the nation of Israel and God. According to Jewish tradition, it was exactly 1 year after Moses first encountered God in the burning bush, in this story, that the children of Israel left Egypt. Exactly 365 days to the day. It's also interesting to note that right after God delivers the nation of Israel out of Egypt, instead of leading them along a direct route, which you would think he would do to the promised land, he actually directs them south to the desert so that he could meet with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, just as he promised he would do in chapter 3. So that was actually Moses' first trip up Sinai. But heading back to Exodus 19, we see that the nation of Israel, again, just 7 weeks after being delivered out of Egypt, is now sitting at the base of this mountain. And Moses is about to make his second trip up. We're told in Exodus 19:3, then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. I mean, it's so interesting what he's about to share with them here. He starts by reminding them of something that if they could only have remembered this, it would have made things so much better for them. He says in verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So God calls Moses up to this place, this familiar place between the two of them. That place where he was first told of his calling to help deliver the Israelites. And there, Moses is given another task. He's told to take this message to the nation of Israel and to ask them if they are in fact willing to obey me fully and keep my covenant. And if they are, then God promises to do this. He says, out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. So in a sense, Moses is delegated to ask them if they would in fact agree to God's terms and whether they would accept this covenant and become his treasured people. So Moses goes down from the mountain, delivers the message to the elders of the people. And when the elders hear of God's proposal, they answer with this. They say, we will do everything the Lord has said. So this brings us to Moses' third trip up the mountain, which was actually to bring the elders' answer back to God. We're told in verse 8, so Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. So Moses heads back up the mountain, and we're told that when he gets up there, God tells him what's going to happen next. He says, the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. So in other words, God says, I'm going to establish to the people that you are my man, that you are my voice to them. And when you speak on my behalf. He's saying, I'm going to give them a visual aid in the form of this thick, dense cloud. And he goes on to say in verse 10, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. So Moses goes down the mountain again and relays all this information to the 2 million plus Israelites. And on the morning of the third day, just like God said he was going to do, we're told that the glory of God has descended upon Sinai in this traumatic and dramatic display of thunder and lightning and billowing smoke and fire. All while Moses and the people are standing at the foot of the mountain. And what does God do? God calls Moses to make his fourth trip up the mountain. And I'll confess to you that the initial reading of this trip up the mountain is kind of funny, probably for everybody, except for Moses. We're told in verse 20, the Lord descended to the top of the mountain and called Moses to come up to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, go down and warn the people so that they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. So do you see what's actually happened here? Moses gets to the top of this mountain, and the very first thing God says to him is, go back down the mountain. Now, getting up to the top of the mountain was a good 1.5 mile hike. And keeping in mind that Moses was likely 80 or 81 years old at this point, I'm sure he was sucking wind pretty hard, kind of like people who had run the marathon today. And I'm sure go back down was the exact opposite of what Moses wanted to hear. But God tells him to go down with a message for the people. Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. So after Moses rejoins the people at the foot of the mountain, God, we're told, begins uttering the 10 commandments to them. He starts by reminding them, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And then he begins to tell them what we understand today to be the 10 commandments. He is audibly telling them, and they're hearing this with their own ears. They hear God, likely in the smoke and the thunder and the lightning, and they're so frightened by it that we're told in chapter 20, starting at 18, when the people saw thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance, and they said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. So the people drew back in terror and pleaded with Moses to be their mediator before God. I think one of the things that's easy for us to miss here is God is doing something really new here. He's presenting himself to this whole group of people, and it's almost as if Yahweh is wanting to move towards intimacy with them. And in this great historic moment, this great event, we have something that happens that's so sad, it's so disappointing. Because we're told that the people stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. I mean, how incredibly sad. Yahweh seeking intimacy with his people, his chosen people. And Israel's response is to take a step back, moving away from him and seeking nothing but distance. Well, Moses tried to persuade the people to open themselves up to this God who wanted to talk to them. And yet they still remained at a distance, which eventually leads to his 5th trip up the mountain. After the people begged him to go and be their mediator, Moses went back up, I'm sure having no idea what to expect from God. And we're told, starting in verse 21, people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourself that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourself gods of silver or gods of gold. And I have to tell you, that's a significant statement for the nation of Israel. Because as you know, it's one of the 10 commandments. It's especially important to them, though, because they have spent their entire lives in Egypt being surrounded by gods of gold and silver. They have lived and worked in homes where people would have had multiple gods of silver and gold. And it was commonplace that they would pause throughout the day to actually worship these idols. This was all part of a normal day in the life of someone living in the Egyptian culture. And God wanted to make sure in this moment that they knew, that they were very sure that they understood that there was only one true God. And he did not embody an object. He goes on to give Moses instructions on building an altar and animal sacrifices and many other things. And after receiving all this, God tells Moses to bring Aaron and his sons and the 70 elders up to the mountain to ratify the terms of this covenant. So Moses goes down from Sinai and he tells the elders everything that God's told him. We're told that Moses wrote down these instructions and the rules into a scroll that was called the Book of the Covenant, and that the people built an altar at the foot of Mount Sinai. The people offered burnt sacrifices, and the people ratified the covenant with these words that we're told specifically in Exodus that they recited in unison. All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. That's what they said. As you might have already guessed, right after this ceremony, Moses makes another trip up, which makes number 6, to the mountain to tell God what the people had decided. We're told that right after the ceremony, he took Aaron and his sons and 70 of the elders up to Sinai to eat what has been called the covenant affirmation meal between the people of Israel and the Lord. And in Exodus 24, it says, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank. Can you imagine what an amazing experience that must have been for them? After they had taken part in this meal, these men descended from the mountain, and no sooner did they get to the bottom of the mountain than, you guessed it, God commanded Moses to come up again. The Lord commanded Moses to once again go back up the mountain and to receive the tablets of stone that were inscribed with the 10 commandments. Verse 24 records, or chapter 24 records it this way. The Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments I have written for their instruction. Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai for 6 days. The cloud covered the mountain. And on the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. The Israelites, keeping in mind they're watching this from the base of the mountain. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud, and he went up the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses goes up to the top of this mountain that's still covered in this shining cloud of fire, And on the seventh day there, during his seventh ascent, Moses hears the voice of the Lord calling to him from inside the cloud, and it invites him to come and enter the very presence of the Lord. We're told that he remained on the mountain for a total of 40 days and 40 nights, and while the Israelites waited for him in the camp below. Now, I will tell you, there are chapters and chapters worth of instructions that God passed on to Moses during this 40 days, regarding everything from the tabernacle to the Ark of the Covenant. But he was also given the 10 Commandments that were written on these tablets of stone. Remember, the nation of Israel had first heard these words straight from God's mouth, where now he was giving them to them in a written form on stone. But while Moses was with God, as we know, it was all breaking loose down in camp. We're told in Exodus 32, when the people saw Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." Aaron answered, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives and your sons and your daughters were wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioned it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up from Egypt." And the one thing that God specifically highlighted for them not to do, they went and they did it. They resorted back to the only thing that they really knew. They resorted back to what Egypt had taught them. And God, knowing that all this was happening, said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." Truthfully, I'm almost speechless after I read this. After all they had been through with God, after all they had seen him do, they had seen with their own eyes him destroy the Egyptians. They had seen with their own eyes the plagues. They had tasted with their lips the water and the manna and the quail that he had miraculously provided. They had likely heard with their ears the thunder from the mountain and God's audible voice. They had likely smelled the burning of the smoke coming from the mountain. After all that had happened, this was their response to God. This was the best that they could do. Well, as you can imagine, God was furious, and Moses pleaded with God to show mercy. Now, I'm certainly not making any excuses for the nation of Israel at this point and that poor behavior, but understand that they didn't know any different than that. They had grown up surrounded by gold idols. They had grown up believing that this is how you worshiped a God, that this is what religion was. They had grown up believing that somehow God's embodied these types of things. It only illustrates to us that they needed to start from square one. They needed to start from scratch because they were spiritual infants, which is exactly why they needed what was written on those stone tablets. Moses came down the mountain, and we're told that this is what happened. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the two tablets of the covenant law in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them into pieces at at the foot of the mountain. Some translations, or the original word there, gives you the impression that it was shattered into pieces. He took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it into powder and scattered it in the water, and he made the people of Israel drink it. Kind of like a parent washing a kid's mouth out with soap. So he stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. And then Moses said, almost again sounding like a parent that's had to severely discipline his kids, he said, "You have been set apart for the Lord today. For you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day." In other words, you have taken a stand today. You have drawn a line in the sand, and you have made a choice. The nation of Israel had turned against the very God who had delivered them. But God understood that in so many ways, they were babies in their faith. They were infants. They were children. And how do you teach children? You teach them by starting with the basics. What God had given them verbally way back in chapter 19, he was now going to give them, not verbally, in a way that could soon be forgotten, not on paper that could blow away or be crumpled or burned. They were going to be given this important list of foundational first steps on something that would last. And it would be chiseled into stone so that it could be passed down from generation to generation. Which brings us right back to the foot of Sinai for Moses' final ascent, for his 8th ascent. After the sin of the golden calf and Moses' destruction of the first set of stone tablets. I mean, you had to wonder, right? Would God even continue with his redemptive plan for Israel? Was it over? Was this incident the last straw? Would this be the end of it all? And as we know, Moses comes before God and he pleads and he appeals for mercy. He says, "Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." Then one of my favorite parts of this story happens, because after Moses hears God's affirming words that say, "Yes, I will show mercy. Yes, I will show compassion," Moses is so overwhelmed that he says, "Now show me your glory." Or I love as another translation puts it, "Oh, let me behold your presence." Chapter 34. The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out stone tablets like the first one, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain." So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up to Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin." And as if those words weren't powerful enough, he goes on to say, "I am making a covenant with you, before all your people. I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. It's interesting, isn't it? In the moment when Moses was questioning the future and questioning what God was going to do, questioning whether he was going to choose to wipe out the whole nation of Israel in that moment because of his anger, what does the Lord do? We're told that he says, "Come, Moses, join me on the mountain. Come visit with me one more time, and I will spend time with you. We will talk. I will reveal myself to you." And Moses did that. And God did reveal himself to Moses in a way that we are told left him both spiritually as well as physically changed. Moses came down and delivers these 2 tablets to the people. And it's fair to say that they were never the same again. You know, it's such an intriguing story, isn't it? And maybe you're sitting here wondering why we have just taken this much time to reflect on the context and the story that surrounds how we got these 10 commandments that we're going to be speaking about for the next 11 weeks. And that's a very valid question. What do we as Christians do with this story? Because we know that this covenant that God made with the nation of Israel was just that. It was between God and Israel. So what relevance does it have for those of us who are committed followers of Jesus? If you're familiar with the New Testament, then you know that we're told that as followers of Jesus, we're no longer subject to the old covenant or the laws found in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, including the 10 Commandments. In fact, Matthew in Hebrews tells us that Jesus came to be, in fact, the fulfillment of the law and to present us with something even better. We're going to talk about that more in the weeks to come. But until then, hold on to this thought. Because we are told in the Gospel of Matthew that in Jesus we find the true fulfillment of the law. Matthew 5:17 and 18 says this, "Do not think that," this is Jesus speaking, "do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them. I have come to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." The New Testament contrasts the old covenant with this new covenant that Jesus came to bring. And this new covenant through Jesus comes with new promises, with a new priesthood, with a new and better hope. And we're now under the perfect law of liberty, as James calls it. But the Old Testament law helps us to understand some universal moral laws, like do not steal and do not kill, and others that we're going to be looking at. The Old Testament law also helps us to understand some specific cultural laws that were specific to the nation of Israel. We're going to be looking at those over the next 10 weeks as we look and dig deeper into the 10 Commandments. I'm really looking forward to this journey with you. Let's pray.